Hey, you lovely lot. I'm Teacher Jess, and welcome back to Geo Cafe. So, today I want to look at monsoons and how these tropical atmospheric events can be both creative and life giving, but also destructive at the same time. Let's check it out. So, I find it really interesting, especially when I took a little bit more of a deep dive into getting background information. And it's actually incredible how many places get impacted by these monsoons. So the monsoons, in just a definition sense, is a type of wind that would change direction with changing seasons. I am going to go through how the monsoons actually form, but in a nutshell, when you have the land getting warm in summer, it can form a low pressure system that brings or pulls wind in towards the land. And when it is cold in winter, it forms a high pressure system that pushes the wind back out. And this change in direction in the wind is a monsoon. Now, typically, because it's in these tropical areas, so we see them in Southeast Asia, Australia, Africa, South America. I've got a nice little map that shows this to us. Because it happens in these very tropical areas where it brings in this warm, moist air, during summer, it will bring a lot of rain. Here we go. So here you can see this is all of the different areas that are impacted by a monsoon or by a seasonal wind. And then obviously that will bring a lot of rain with it. What I found really interesting is how it impacts Africa as well. And yet we don't seem to look at it in the South African curriculum. I'm not quite sure why. But this is all examples of monsoons. So in the summer over here, the wind will blow from the ocean inland and will bring moisture and rain with it. And then as the seasons shift and now the southern hemisphere has summer, now the wind will blow in over here, and there you can see the wind has changed direction in the northern hemisphere and is blowing back to the ocean. Now, typically, India is the most common example or case study that we look at when we talk about the monsoons, and it's the case study that the textbook looks at, so we're going to stick to that one and we're going to take another look at that. But let's first just understand what monsoons are and how they form. So I've got this little map over here, and I'm going to try and draw it and guide us through how these monsoons form because of the seasons. So this is my map of India. I don't know if it's nice and clear for you guys. I think India is frequently used as the case study because the monsoons are just so prominent over here. I think because of the layout of the continent, of the land, and the nearby ocean, it just has such a strong monsoon and it varies so much in the seasons. So this is our summer. Should we start with summer? Yeah, let's start with summer. Let's make summer red. So with summer comes a lot of warmth. So this is hot, this is warm. Do we maybe need to label this as just hot? Because summer. There we go. Hot. Now, hopefully you guys remember that when land gets hot or the air gets hot, the air will rise. So if we kind of picture this from a side view, let's imagine that this is the continent. This is supposed to be a side view. Some ocean. There we go. And then this is warm there. And because it's warm, the hot air will rise, which means that over here, over the land, we have a low pressure system. Hopefully this makes sense so far. So the continent will heat up faster than the surrounding ocean, which forms a low pressure system because the hot air is rising. Now, I realized that I made the ocean blue. I'm actually going to make it purple just to indicate the temperature. So these oceans are always warm, but they're kind of relative to the land. So this is warm, yes, but in summer, it's not as warm as the land. So because it's relatively cooler, let's just say cooler. Okay, so we're going to call this cool. It's not as hot. It's still warm. These tropical oceans are definitely still warm, but it's not as hot as inland. And then because it's cooler, it will actually develop a slight high pressure. So this is This area is cooler than this area. This area, because it's warm, the hot air rises, it forms a low pressure. And then over here, we have a high pressure that develops. So let's draw that in. Here we go. Over here as well. I think I'm drawing it in the right place. I hope I am. We have a high pressure, and then wind will blow from the high to the low. Okay, and now we kind of have this complete little circuit. So we've got air sinking over the ocean, over the high pressure. We have warm air rising over the land, and this very moist, very warm air busy being blown in. Now, the thing to remember is that over here, we have another interesting geographical feature. Hopefully you'll know that this is where the Himalayas are, the mountain range. I know, not the best highlighter, but we're doing what we can. Okay, so let's put the mountain there as well. And the reason why the mountain is important is because it will also force any wind to rise, like that. So any wind that's not rising from the low pressure system will also be forced to rise when it reaches the mountains. And that will bring us rain. Okay, hopefully that's making sense, at least in the side view diagram. So let's just complete it over here as well. Okay, if we have a high pressure in the northern hemisphere, it will be circulating clockwise. Okay, so the wind will be blowing like that. Okay, I did draw it on the wrong side. Yep, there we go. Okay, which means that the wind will blow in like that. Okay, and then it's blowing towards a low pressure system. So it brings with it all of this warm, moist air that will condense. It will rise, it will make clouds. We need some clouds in this diagram. There we go. And then, of course, it brings a lot of rain. That is the summer monsoon. In winter, we have the opposite. Now, at this point, the land will be cold because it's winter. Makes sense. Beautiful coloring and skills. Then the ocean would be warmer than the land. So you see, I'm using that same purple again. The reason why I'm using the purple is to show you that the ocean, it changes temperature really slowly. So I'm trying to show that it's relatively the same temperature. It does change with the seasons. So at the end of summer, it would be warmer than the start of summer. In the end of winter, it would be colder than the start of winter. But I'm just trying to show that it's kind of the fluctuation is very little compared to the land. In land, it changes a lot more. Okay, so now we can see that it's warmer than inland, which means that inland is cold, the air sinks, and we have a high pressure system there because cold. So looking at it from a side view, warmer, and above the land it is cold. Speaking of cold, let me have some coffee. And because it's cold, the air is sinking and it makes a high pressure. And then because this is relatively warmer, the air is rising and it forms a low pressure. There we go. Okay, and our first law of wind is that the wind will blow from a high pressure to a low pressure. So it blows from there to there. So now we can see that the wind is blowing in the other direction. It's blowing from the land to the sea. So there is our high pressure because it's cold. Here is our low pressure because it's relatively warmer. And this is how it then blows from there to there. Okay, and because all of the wind is blowing out towards the sea or from the land to the ocean, it doesn't have any moisture. It will be very dry wind. So it'll be quite cold, quite dry, which means that inland would be very little, if not no rain. So summer we tend to associate with very heavy rain, thunderstorms, and moisture that comes in from the ocean to the land, and it brings with moisture and rain and all of those lovely things. Okay, so we understand now that the land heats up faster than the ocean and it forms a low pressure system, which means that the high pressure system over the ocean will blow warm, moist air to the land. then that warm, moist air will blow in. It will maybe meet the low pressure, or it will meet some type of a mountain range or an obstruction or something that will force it to rise, and that will bring rain. Now, I was saying that we were looking specifically at India, and in India, this can last from about June to September, and it can bring most of their rain. One source I read said about 70%, and one actually said 80% of their total annual rainfall. So we can see that these monsoons are very, very important as it's their primary source of water for the year. And then in the winters, it's the opposite. Winter is very dry, very clear skies because it's cold. We have this high pressure system inland, and that blows the air away from the coastline or into the ocean, and it prevents any type of condensation or rainfall from forming. So I will say that for a grade 11 topic, because that's where this is covered, for a grade 11 topic, this is about as much as you would need to know if you are studying it for school, for your exam or test or anything else. You would need to know how it forms, why we have these high and low pressures and all of that stuff, how the wind will blow in, land, or blow away, and how it would condense and bring rain, and how these two seasons have then a lot of rainfall in summer and very little rainfall in winter. Now, I wasn't happy to just leave it there. I wanted to go a little bit further, and I wanted to take a look at how the monsoons are impacted by other things and how the monsoons also impact people and environments and all of those stuff. Okay, so what I did find really interesting was how El Nino and La Nina are also linked to the monsoons. We understand, hopefully, that this wind that forms here depends on this difference in temperature. So when this is warmer than this, we get the wind forming. We get the low pressure and we get the high pressure. The warmer the land is to the ocean, the stronger the wind will be. But that's also true for the opposite. If the land isn't much warmer than the ocean, if they're kind of similar, we're not going to have a very strong wind, which means that the monsoons will actually be weaker. The summer monsoons will be weaker and it won't bring much cloud or much rainfall. And then the same thing for La Nina. La Nina typically sees colder ocean waters over here, which means that the wind blowing in would be stronger because the temperature difference is greater. The wind would be stronger and you would have a stronger monsoon season. So we do see these impacts in India when we have El Nino or La Nina. We can have a failed monsoon or a very extreme monsoon. Now, monsoons by themselves are really important. I mentioned that there's something like 70 or 80% of the water supply or the annual rainfall for India. And I mean, needless to say, everything depends on that. All types of drinking water, agriculture, food production, all of that depends on those monsoons or that rain. They don't have a lot of groundwater or like aquifers, so they can't exactly use borehole water, or even when they do, they'll deplete it quite quickly, or they deplete a lot of it if they will irrigate instead of using rainfall. And on top of that, they also have a lot of production for hydroelectric power. And hydroelectricity, I'm sure you'd figured from the name, you need flowing water. So we need that rainfall and we need that water to keep that electricity going. But that doesn't mean that the monsoons can't be incredibly destructive. So we already spoke about how El Nino or La Nina can strengthen or weaken a monsoon. And in this case, we can see what happens if the monsoons are too strong. If the summer rain is just too much, we can have flooding, flash flooding, landslides, so all types of secondary natural disasters. If you have a lot of water building up in the soil, it can cause all kinds of mass movements, which is just destructive and damaging in its own right. And on top of that, you can have failure in agriculture. So you can have soil erosion, you can have complete flooding of the agricultural area, which means crop loss and food loss for that year. And that's not even mentioning any kind of infrastructure damage or, settlements that are impacted. I did find an article that I wanted to take a look at. Here we go. So the heavy monsoons can cause a lot of damage. We have urban areas that can be flooded, almost a meter and a half, or sorry, almost a half a meter. That is a lot of water where you don't want it to be. That looked fairly recent, yes. So from the 3rd of June, why monsoons wreak havoc annually in Indian cities. I mean, I would not want to go to work, be walking to work through all of that rain. That just sounds like a nightmare. And it seems like one of the big problems is that the urban areas and the cities don't really seem prepared for these massive monsoons. So it can really disrupt all types of activities in the city. The damage is one thing, but if we're talking about things like roads turning into rivers and vehicles broken down, we need to also consider the economic impact of that. So we're not just looking at the economic impact of things flooding and getting damaged and being expensive in food and agriculture, but also the fact that people can't get to work. You're going to have all types of businesses being disrupted, transport that's not happening, communication between businesses that's broken down, people not getting to work, people maybe not getting home from work, kids not getting to school. There's going to be a lot of knock-on economic impacts from this. And it very much seems like when they mention over here the city's fragile infrastructure, it definitely seems like a lot of these cities aren't actually prepared for these floods. They just kind of manage the disasters as they come. They mention that they do have installed dewatering pumps for the areas, began manually clearing water away. The action came too late. So they mention unplanned urbanization, poor infrastructure, years of neglect. So there's definitely a lot of urban planning that needs to go into preparing for these monsoons, especially if they are such a critical part of the economy and of just existing in India. So there needs to be more done in those areas. And then I found an article that was speaking to, I think it was was it a landslide? Yes, a landslide. So this is then that knock-on impact. So this is not directly the rain and the flooding, but this is how it can impact the environment, which would cause its own natural disaster again and impact the people. So we have this torrential rain that lasted for several days. We have this torrential rainfall, this knee-deep water, and this extreme weather, and sure, 103 millimeters. That is a lot of rain. No, all of that rain had eventually not only flooded the areas, but it caused landslides, which would then block off roads, cause more infrastructure damage, cause more environmental damage, danger to people, and all of those things. Look at that. All of that underwater. So here they mention again using those pipes to clear the roads, or those pumps to clear the roads. The highest precipitation in a single day, 153 millimeters of rain on one day. That is incredible. That is insane. Sure. And again, this is necessary rain. It's necessary rain that you need to keep your country alive. So you need to actually find ways to prepare for it, to manage it a bit better. But then I also want to go to the other side of the story. On the other side, during an event like El Nino, you can actually have failed rains or a failed monsoon, which basically means that you don't get enough rainfall for that year. And when I was doing a bit of research in this 2015 El Nino, I realized that South Africa also had its own disaster at this time. We also had a critical drought that was probably one of the worst droughts that I can remember, especially in the Western Cape. They had this countdown to day zero where they were literally counting down the number of days until the dams were empty. So I find it really interesting that we have another country over here that suffered such a severe drought as a result of El Nino. And that just shows how widespread the impacts of El Nino are. And this I found in a report. So just to show you what the report actually was, here we go. So it's a very long report. I'm definitely not going to go through it, but I did like the fact that I could narrow down a few main topics. This was a report looking at the impact of the drought in 2015 and 16 that was released, I think it was the December, end of December 2016. Very useful and very informative report. And it looked at what happens when they did not get enough rain during that time. And if I remember correctly, here it is. The monsoons only brought 86% of their usual rain, and that was little enough for it to be considered a drought. And some of the impacts that this report ran over, I've just summarized over here. Things like water insecurity and safety. So, people not having access to basic everyday water. It did bring into question how that water was used. So, more farms were using for irrigation. So, they weren't using rainfall or surface water, they were maybe using different forms of borehole water or other water reserves and using irrigation rather than rainfall, which means that there was less water storage. And less water storage means that any types of chemicals that can infiltrate into the soil or into the water would be more concentrated because there is less volume of water. And it does also mean that there's less access to water for the general public. Then, with needing water for irrigation and water for crop, that does also mean that you have food insecurity. So, crop failure, crop not getting enough water, especially in those tropical areas, you have crop that is very water demanding and very sensitive to not getting enough water. If you have a crop failure, that does mean no food. And that's not a case of no food for shops or markets or something. This also impacts your subsistence farmers. So there's a lot of farmers in India or other countries as well where they are just growing enough produce to support themselves. And if they don't have enough rainfall or even means of irrigation so that they can grow food for themselves or their family, it means no food. And not only no food, but it means no balanced diet. A lot of families went without veggies and important parts of any type of nutritious balanced diet, which did then impact health as well. So the report did also mention how a lot of people were getting sick because of not having access to food, enough food, or balanced diets. And because of this water shortage, they saw more and more people giving up basic personal hygiene because they literally did not have access to water. Not because they were being conservative and using less water, it just wasn't there. And of course, I mentioned that your subsistence farmers can't support themselves, but if we look at commercial farmers as well, if we look at growing produce or growing crop for livestock, livestock also had a shortage of food. And then on top of that, anyone who is maybe like a seasonal laborer who might come and help out on the farm for harvesting or working on the farm for that growing season, they maybe didn't have work that season, or maybe work was delayed. They were told not to come until later on in the season when there was actually something to grow, which meant that a lot of people lost their income as well. And then the interesting thing that I found on top of all of this was that education was also impacted. So, with this strain on families and economies, a lot of children were dropping out of school or staying home so they could try to help out. And I'm sorry, all kids need to be in school. And maybe that's just my biased opinion as a teacher, but when things are impacting education, then things are really going pear-shaped. So it's definitely interesting to see how we have these extremes on both sides, how we have this excessive flooding and heavy rainfall when the monsoons are too strong, and how we have these droughts and disasters when the monsoons don't come or there's not enough of it. But looking into the monsoons in India a little bit more, it was really interesting to see that it doesn't just impact the environment and the economy and all of those things, and that the monsoons aren't necessarily just this destructive force of nature that brings floods and droughts and disaster in every direction. It can, but it's also such a critical part of their lives in India that a lot of traditions and cultures actually revolve around it. And it's needless to say that this doesn't just apply in India, this will apply to other parts of the world as well, where the monsoons are probably part of or so important of your existence in that culture, in that country, that it becomes a part of your culture. And the one thing that I found really interesting was this festival, Tej. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Please, I'm sorry if I'm not. But it's a festival that's celebrated by women in India, and it celebrates marriage and family ties. And it's also coincides with the start of the monsoon season. So it celebrates the beginning of the monsoon. And we can see that these monsoons are seen as a blessing. They are a relief from the heat, which I can understand. They bring the rain, they're a relief from the heat, and they are also the source of abundance and creativity and just plenty. So I thought this was a very nice note to end the monsoons on, because we can see that they're not just these destructive atmospheric events, but they are also a part of culture and tradition and just so critical to countries like India. Well, I hope that you learned something new and that you found this interesting. I definitely did. I really enjoyed researching this section. I had to do a lot of research because there just was not enough in the textbooks, and I really enjoyed going a little bit further into it. And it did leave me wondering what other atmospheric events actually have deeper impacts on countries and communities as well. Hopefully, you had a few questions answered and maybe you learned something interesting. Otherwise, have a lovely day further, and hopefully, I will see you again next time. Cheers! Bye!